this has, in Los Angeles, become a place where there's been a tremendous flowering of social movements that have challenged labor relations and fought for the living wage, and now a minimum wage going up to $15 an hour, which is the biggest city that it's happened in. Tremendous immigrant rights movement, tremendous environmental justice movement, sort of widespread acceptance of LGBT rights, massive transformations. And those transformations in Los Angeles, which we welcome you to, didn't come out simply because of good ideas or new policies. They came out of tremendous long-term visioning and organizing by community-based groups to try to shift the narrative and the dialogue in the city and try to help set this city up as an example for beginning to shift the rest of the nation as well. So what we're going to talk about in this session is essentially social movements and the sort of intersection of philanthropy with social movements. I'm going to introduce the panel, then I'm going to ask I'm going to pretend to ask a leading question to each of them, which they will sort of probably gleefully ignore and say whatever they wanted to say as their opening comments, and then we'll try to get into conversation and get you all involved as well. We're pleased to have with us, and I'll move in the direction from my left to my right, your right to my left. First, Evelyn Wolfson, who is the founder and president of Freedom to Marry, the campaign to win marriage overall, nationwide. And of course, this is a movement which triumphed. And he's going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to say that it's not simply that he's worked hard on this issue. He actually wrote in 1983 his Harvard Law School thesis on gay people and the freedom to marry, indicating that he's one of the few people who actually wrote a useful thesis on their way to a graduate degree, something that actually wound up sort of changing the world. So really glad that Evan is here. Next to him is Cristina Jiménez, who is the managing director of the United We Dream network. If we were to think about successful social movements in the last several years, certainly the Dreamers are one, able to really articulate what they wanted and change essentially the narrative to challenge traditional immigrant rights organizations by pushing this issue, even in the context of the 2012 campaign, securing a major change in policy through the original DACA, and really reanimating the struggle for immigrant rights. Cristina herself is a dreamer and the co-founder of the United We Dream network. She has been named as one of the Forbes 30 under 30 in law and policy, which causes many of us to be envious for two reasons. One is many of us have never been named the anything of anything, and certainly many of us wish we were still under 30. I know, I do. That would be half my age, and I'm quite jealous. Anyway, I've admired her from afar and got a chance to meet you just once, and she's really one of my heroines in this movement. And then finally, because we were making sure that we brought together someone working on LGBT rights and someone working on immigrant rights, we wanted to bring someone, Matt Foreman, who is the Senior Director of Gay and Immigrant Rights programs at the Evelyn and Walter Haas. Really, after those two, there was no one else to choose, Matt. So Matt, he works for the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund in San Francisco. It's been the largest non-gay foundation that's been a funder in the movement for LGBT rights, but he's also been, as you'll hear, quite articulate at making intersectionality not a multisyllabic word in a law school, but something that's actually real in the way that people do organizing. So I want to I was asked to set this up by talking a little bit about my own work. That's, of course, dangerous to ask an academic to talk about their own work, other than for me to say that you should probably buy my new book, Equity, Growth, and Community, which actually is also available as a free download at a website called growingtogethermetro.org. And I know that there's a few students here from Price. That's going to be on your exam. So let me say just a word about how I've kind of come to the social movement studies and work. I talked about the transformation of this city, and I was actually in the late 1980s part of a group of people who were trying to organize to transform the city and think about social justice concerns. So I've been in the midst of labor struggles, civil rights struggles, environmental justice struggles for the last 25, 30 years. And then about 8 years ago, the California Endowment said, you've been working with social movements. Why don't you turn your analytical lens to ask the question, how do they work and how can we support them going forward? So it was an interesting turn from being just an ally to studying, but studying from the role of an ally and making sure that our ideas got checked out with the movement organizations themselves. And we wound up writing a series of reports on social movements. And the things I would just kind of highlight from that is that we came up with a top 10 list of the elements of social movements because we realized nobody would remember anything but a top 10 list. But if you wanted to make it even simpler, there's sort of three kinds of things. One is the fundamentals of social movements, and that's about making sure that you've got a narrative and a vision. Van Jones famously said that Martin Luther King didn't go to Washington with all those folks and march and then give a speech called I Have an Issue. The speech was I Have a Dream, and it's about making sure that issues actually are tied into a larger narrative, that movements need to have an authentic base, real constituencies. It's not enough. I mean, some people have a Twitter following, and they call that a movement, unlike, say, Black Lives Matter, which has both a Twitter following and a really on-the-ground kind of movement. So authentic base, and then be in it for the long term. Those are sort of the fundamentals. The mechanics, the sort of second bit of this, is about having a theory of how the state works. It's about really, for most folks, talking about the economy. It's about figuring out the mechanics of campaigns and pragmatic policy wins to be able to motivate people to move forward. That's a lot of what we're going to hear about in the Freedom to Marry campaign, is both the big vision but also the pragmatics of doing it. And the third big bucket, which we think is really crucial, is scaling. How do you go from sort of a single issue to working with other organizations? How do you grow in size? One thing that we sort of warned funders about in our early reports is sometimes funders are really attracted by small groups because they think they're authentic. Sometimes they're small just because they're small. And if we have such large problems, we have such large challenges that we often need to organize groups that could actually meet the scale of those challenges, and figuring out how to do that while remaining authentic, while having a base and having a strategy. Those are all the sort of magic of social movements. We're going to hear a little bit about that today. So you just heard about an arc, basically 7 years of research in 5 minutes. I feel either very crisp or very diminished by the fact that I could reduce it to that. And I'm going to give each of our panelists their own 5 minutes to get started. And we'll start with Evan and ask, tell us a little bit about the Freedom to Marry campaign, about its arc, and what you think was essential to sort of moving it forward.
Well, you actually gave a very good summary of many of the key elements that I think were things we mostly got right, although with many, many stumbles and missed opportunities along the way. So I could do my own version of your elements, but maybe we'll get to that later. But what I will say as an overview is that it took, I would say, 4 key elements to get to the success we celebrated in winning marriage nationwide. One is the Constitution, the American system, which, however imperfect the document and the system are, do give us the opportunity and the tools to change things. And that's a privilege we have as Americans that not everybody does have. We need that Constitution. We need that system that allows for democratic engagement and change. But of course, the Constitution didn't do it by itself. It required us to get in there and execute, to get in there and do the work. So the other 3 elements that I think the Freedom to Marry cause had mostly right and that are the source of the success are, number one, a movement. it took a movement to do this. No one person, no one organization, no one battle, no one state, no one methodology, litigation, legislation, etc., no one year, no one decade did this. It was more than 4 decades in the making, and that was millions of conversations, millions of dollars raised and donated through philanthropy and invested in this work. It was many organizations, many people, many players, many parts. It was a movement that caused this tremendous change, not only in the law, but in understanding. But at the same time, it wasn't just a random set of actions. There was a strategy. There was a strategy that this movement followed. Now, not everybody knew they were following a strategy. Not everyone necessarily agreed they were following a strategy or that there was a strategy. Not everyone had that way of thinking about it. But there was a strategy. And I can talk more about the strategy down the road when we get there. But we had a strategy for getting there, not just a movement of churn. Constitution, movement, strategy. The fourth element that we mostly got right and that I believe contributed to the success was we had a campaign. There was a campaign. There was an entity that, although it didn't do everything, it took a movement to do everything. It took many pieces to do all the things that were needed. But there was a campaign built to drive that strategy, to make sure that all the things the strategy said were needed to get to the victory were happening, whether through the work of others, which we could lift up, or by filling in the gaps and supplying those pieces ourselves. And that campaign was Freedom to Marry, the campaign that I'm now on the cusp of shutting down because this goal has been achieved. So I think it's important to celebrate all of these because sometimes there's a tendency, as you just alluded to either look purely to the grassroots or purely to this part or this methodology, whatever. And those things are all important and often do get ignored, the movement piece. But at the same time, it wasn't just grassroots and diverse and wonderful out there and everybody did their piece. There was coherence, there was a strategy, there was investment of time and money in a strategy, and there was building a campaign that could focus on leveraging that movement and driving the strategy to get the work done. And that's how we won.
So I'm going to turn to Cristina, but before, let me ask you just one question. We'll get to the strategy pieces later. Sometimes there's a moment where you know you've won. I mean, obviously it's when you actually win, the Supreme Court ruling, et cetera, but there's a moment before it when you know the tide has turned. This was the marker that in your head you went, okay, this one we got. You see that in labor campaigns, immigrant campaigns. There's a moment. Was there a moment when you thought, okay, we got this. This looks like we're going to win?
I'm maybe the unusual kind of person. I actually always believed we were going to win. I really believed in writing in 1983, certainly once I began working on it in earnest a few years later, and for the next 30-some years of my own life, not even counting the 40-plus years that it took to get there that began before me. I actually always believed we were going to win. And I would say that if anything was the moment where it went from being a dream to being now a campaign that we needed to drive, it was the case in the 1990s, the Hawaii case, in which for the first time we were able to get a court to actually give us a true day in court and to be able to make the arguments in favor of the freedom to marry and to contest the reasons being offered by the state for denying it. And that resulted in the world's first ever win, which was then snatched away politically. But unlike the first wave of marriage litigation, where couples had gone to court and had been agitating nationally to win in the 1970s, the cases that I was writing about in the 1980s, all of those cases, all of those battles, all of that national ferment was just sort of rubber stamped away because the country and the conversation and the courts were not ready. When in the 1990s, we were able to actually get that day in court and then won, even though it was snatched away and we had another 20 years of battling ahead, to me that was clear we were going to win.
That's great. So I've just learned many things, but one of which is that if you want to pick stocks for the future, you might want to stick with Evan, since his long-term bets seem to pay off.
Well, at least in social change. I don't know about stock.
Okay. So no financial advice, just social movement advice. Okay.
Go with your strength.
Cristina, tell us a little bit about United We Dream and what your approach has been collectively to building a movement, particularly in these just challenging times of the rise of xenophobia in its most virulent forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for having us here, joining this conversation. From our perspective at United We Dream, us mainly coming from a place of being organizers, most of us back in the early 2000s when many of us were organizing in our local communities, it was very clear that creating the realities that we needed for our communities to be empowered was a necessity. So we brought people together to share their stories and to build relationships, one out of the necessity to be able to create safe spaces for undocumented people that have been living in fear all this time, but also to empower us to a place where we can actually take action. And as we have been doing our work in the last couple of years, what has been very critical for us, and I can see ourselves through these elements that you described, where our stories were a source of transformation within ourselves. The moment that you come out for the first time, very much inspired by the LGBTQ movement, was transformational for us. For many of us that lived in fear and who have family members that continue to live in fear of being deported. And it was that transformational experience that created the conditions for us to have a shared vision and a shared identity that evolved to a shared narrative, right? Like one of the elements that you talked about. And having the authentic voices, the voices of people directly affected by the issues to be front and center of the work that we have been doing. So relationship building has been definitely a foundational piece for us. Stories and narrative have been also a foundational element because that created a sense of safety for us and empowerment, but it also helped us convey the vision that we had for this country. And we've also gone through an arc of strategic choices, right? So in 2010, when there was a debate nationally about comprehensive immigration reform, United We Dream and immigrant youth across the country made a strategic choice to demand that the DREAM Act gets its vote by itself. Our analysis at the time was that the chances for immigration reform were weak and that we needed to give it a shot to a strategy that would push the DREAM Act for a vote. That was a strategic choice that even though it did not lead to a victory of the DREAM Act, which obviously winning policy changes that will change our lives and the lives of our communities are huge and significant victories, but even though all of our work that we have been doing from the early 2000s through 2010 did not lead to us having a DREAM Act, it did lead us to the birth of a movement. And for us, that was a huge victory. That I don't see ourselves being able to have achieved that victory without the work of relationship building, storytelling, making strategic choices, but also redefining how we think of victories in movement building work, and even how all of our allies and foundations think about victories. And so from our perspective, obviously policy changes are huge victories and are necessary. But from our perspective, empowering your people, young people who were fearful and have been fearful for a very long time in our communities, is also a victory. And even though we didn't win the DREAM Act in 2010, our ability to bring thousands of young, undocumented folks together to share their stories, to take over the Capitol, to do actions in Congress, all of that was a victory by itself as well.
It's great. And I'm struck by the role of popular culture, certainly in the Freedom to Marry campaign, but also this kind of narrative and kind of changing the cultural image of who these undocumented kids were. Was that a very conscious strategy?
So I will say that, it was 40 of us, and I remember this in Minnesota, and it was really cold. And many of us have been really fearful, actually, of sharing our stories. I remember when I was asked to share my story publicly for the first time, it was probably 2004 or 2005, and I was terrified. And, even though the slogan of our movement has become, we are undocumented and unafraid and unapologetic, what I share with many of the young people that we engage now, a new generation of folks, is that we were really afraid, actually.
Yeah.
And I was afraid of putting myself at the risk of being deported and my family as well. But, many of us came together, and this was in 2009 as we were thinking about how to push this federal campaign for the DREAM Act forward. And it became really clear that we needed to let go of the fear and put our stories and our faces out there. And it came more from a place of liberation for ourselves. And having a transformational process for ourselves, but also wanting the country to sort of be faced with the contradiction that our families and ourselves have, right? Like, we are people that grew up here. This is our home, is our country. We believe in the values of opportunity, justice, and freedom. And all of a sudden, we're caught up in this situation where we don't see equal opportunity. We see a lot of discrimination. We feel marginalized. And the values that we have embraced and learned about this country were not reflective in our own lives. And so that's where it came from. And I think when the 40 of us left and we had all decided that we were going to have events throughout the country where young people were going to share their stories, whether that was at a press event or at a church or using YouTube at the time, I understood that we were in a movement moment when I saw thousands of young people sharing their stories via social media and or other ways that we had not even touched. And it was these 40 organizers that went back that inspired a generation of young people to come out and to share their stories. And we understood at that moment, one, that it had become a movement. Number two, that beyond the transformation of self, we were transforming the narrative of the country around this issue, putting a face to a debate that had been focused on border security and images of Mexican immigrants jumping a wall, to human beings. And I think one of the huge victories that our movement has achieved is that we have humanized young immigrants, and we have decriminalized their existence here. However, there's still a lot of work to do, because the same acceptance and embracement that this country has for people like me, it's not there for my parents. Yeah. And so that, highlights the work that we have to do.
Great. I don't think you have a full sense of how much I admire you and your bravery. Matt, you've been coming at this, from the understanding of movement organizing, but really from a funder perspective too. So you're actually been funding both of these kind of areas of work. So how did Haas come to that? And what are sort of the biggest lessons you've learned as a funder trying to support social movements?
Well, Haas Jr. is a family foundation, descendants of Levi Strauss, and our priorities reflect the family's values. And I'm fortunate enough to work at a family foundation where those values, I think, align with my values and I hopefully the American dream values. And so we're supporting immigrant rights because Levi Strauss and Company had many plants in the U.S. Many of them were immigrant workers, and our trustees and the family had deep respect for those immigrants and their families and saw firsthand the struggles they had in reaching, or hopefully reaching, the American dream. And our focus on immigrant rights comes from one of our trustees, Bob Haas, who was chair, and he is chairman emeritus of Levi Strauss, and I think some very searing experiences that he had in the 80s when HIV hit San Francisco very hard. And I think it was, I won't speak for him, but he said that it was personally transformative to see and understand, even in San Francisco, even at Levi Strauss, the way that gay employees there felt terrified of coming out, and then the devastation that we saw with AIDS and HIV just decimating thousands of people in San Francisco, and then of course across the country and the world. So this is a personal value of our trustees, and it's a privilege to work with people that have those kind of values. Having come from the nonprofit world and worked so hard to bow and scrape and before foundations, and mainly unsuccessfully, to try to sell my cause, I never really understood what I was doing wrong, or why foundations didn't get why what I was pitching to them was so urgent and important. And now being on the other side of the table, I see all the mistakes that I made in not really talking to foundations in the language that and the priority areas that they were particularly interested in. But one thing that I've seen in our giving at Haas Junior has changed over the years based on 60 years of giving and seeing what worked and didn't work. And I think one thing that we have taken very much away from the gay and lesbian program, marriage equality in particular, and the immigrant rights program is, and I know Evan's going to touch on this later, but is setting a goal and then supporting organizations that are aligned behind that goal, as opposed to random grant making to LGBT organizations that are doing good work in the world, or random grants to immigrant rights organizations in California that are focused, as you said, in one area and don't have connections or don't share a common vision or common policy outcome. And so it's having a goal, which for Haas Junior, we are very policy outcome focused, and I know that that's a challenge for movements writ large, but that seems to be where we feel, based on our experience, we've had the most success.
You know, that later has come. Evan, he was saying that you're going to talk later about outcomes. And I know in our preliminary conversation, you really stressed the fact that you need a goal, you need a campaign, and as well as a broader movement. Can you talk a little bit about the strategy, campaign, goals, and then why you, from your own experience, then what the conversation we had before about this?
So my version of your distillation of your studies, I call the ladder of clarity, and I talk about the way in which the Freedom to Marry work, with imperfections, got it pretty right on this ladder of clarity that I believe movements and particularly campaigns need to have. You start with the highest rung. You start with where are you trying to go? Clarity of goal. And it is in one of the happy consequences of winning and then having won something important is that you get asked a lot to share the lessons and talk to other movements, and that's what I've been doing a lot of, and that's what I think I'll be doing the bulk of my time over the next year or two. And what I find is it is really astonishing how many of the organizations and causes I am speaking with who are doing important, hard work are not where they need to be. And even having the clarity of the goal, they can't even really, with clarity for themselves, state what winning is. If you can't say what winning is, it's very hard to win. It's very hard to get others to rally to your cause. It's very hard to sustain the hard, difficult toil and ups and downs of work. So clarity of goal is crucial. And if you think about it, in fighting for the freedom to marry, we chose a goal. Now, it was not the goal of the entire movement. It was not the goal, first of all, not everybody agreed with it. But what I also mean is that it wasn't the only thing we wanted. I mean, winning the freedom to marry, important as it is, transformative as it has been, is not the sum total of everything lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and the people who care about them need. We have larger goals in our movement. But to just say your goal is everything is almost like saying you don't have a goal. Your goal is nothing. You have to pick something because that's how you achieve something. So we chose something that was big and bold and hard and long-term and not something everybody agreed on, but that we believe, those of us who support it, would be transformative. And whether you agreed with it or disagreed with it, it was clear what the goal was: winning marriage nationwide. From clarity of goal, working down this ladder of clarity, you have clarity of strategy. What is it going to take to get to your goal? And my recommendation to philanthropists is that they should fund good strategy and then stick with it, because the strategy may not succeed every 3 seconds. It may take a while, as you heard from Cristina and as you heard even myself allude to how long this took to deliver on the strategy. But fortunately, we were lucky to have visionary funders like Haas who not only embraced the goal, but stuck with us in the strategy, despite the ups and downs in delivering on that strategy. From clarity of strategy, you need clarity of vehicles. So if your strategy calls for, as ours did, for example, winning marriage, we said we were going to win by getting the Supreme Court to do right in a marriage case what it had refused to do in 1972 when it got marriage wrong. In other words, our strategy was we needed to win in the Supreme Court. It was the Supreme Court that was going to bring the country to national resolution. But the Supreme Court had already rebuffed us. We'd already failed in the Supreme Court in 1972. So the strategy said, what do we need to do to create the climate, to lay the foundation, to be able to get back to the Supreme Court at the right time with hopefully the right justices and the right case, having done what was necessary to get them now to do it right. And a mere 40-some years later, we succeeded in doing that. And what was the strategy to do that? The strategy was to build a critical mass of states and a critical mass of support and tackle the federal discrimination that had been put on top of the state denial of marriage that we were challenging. And working on those 3 tracks, building those critical mass of support in states, we would create the climate that would allow the Supreme Court to get right what it had gotten wrong, that would move the country as well as the court. And so the strategy was to aim and work on that path, and the vehicles were the programs and the actions and the targets that we needed to invest in and figure out how to do and succeed on in order to build that critical mass of states. In some states, we could win through litigation. In some states, we hoped to be able to win through legislation. In some states, we were going to have to win at the ballot box. Each state had its own dynamics. So you analyze and you do the work and you build the infrastructure and you pull together the team, and where you have people to work with, you work with them, and where you don't have them, you have to supply them to be able to begin winning the first state, then the second state, then the 5th state, and begin leveraging all of that toward the goal. The goal was never to win all 50 states within the 4 corners of each state, plodding through Mississippi in 2030. The goal was to win enough states to have that critical mass. Likewise, when we were building this critical mass of public support, when I was doing that first case in Hawaii that I talked about earlier back in the 1990s, the first time we were able to win, getting a day in court, we were at 27% nationwide. By the time we got to the Supreme Court again and were able to deliver this win, we had grown that support to 63%. So in literally less than 20 years, we had been able to find the stories, the messengers, the drumbeat of repeated messaging, the persuasion, the narrative, etc., that helped people think anew and moved hearts and minds and tapped into the generational momentum. It took the vehicles of programs and research to crack the code on how best to present the message, and the investment in the strategies for getting those voices out there, whether it's getting people to tell their stories or spark conversations or run ads or enlist Hollywood, all these kinds of different pieces. Those were the vehicles. And then fourth on the ladder of clarity, from goal, strategy, vehicles, is action steps. We worked hard to be clear about what were we asking people to do. People, organizations, funders, how could they bring their piece to the work? And it required the clarity of the goal and the clarity of the strategy for them to see why they should do it and how they could bring their part to it.
You know, I'm struck by this analysis because what it reminds me is the difference between We Are the 99% and the Fight for 15, which has a very clear goal, raise the minimum wage, doesn't solve inequality at all, really. It just does lift up the bottom of the labor market. Strategies about how to do that and how to do it in municipal areas, then bubble up to the states, the vehicles of municipal authorities, and then the action steps of actually supporting these things. So it's a very useful kind of analysis. Christina, can you talk a little bit about the intersections? Particularly, I mean, it seems to me like, in particular, the Dreamers and immigrant youth in general really think about their intersections with labor, with Black Lives Matter, with a number of with the LGBTQ movement, et cetera, that there's a, for your generation in particular, intersectionality is kind of in the soup and not just something people have to strive to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, intersectionality is really at the core of our work, and it comes from a place of both understanding that when we are coming to do this work, I don't come in and our folks don't come in to do this work just as undocumented immigrants or undocumented youth or undocumented students, but that we also come in with our whole selves, which means we're also women and immigrant and undocumented. And some of us are also LGBTQ and undocumented. And all of us are workers to some extent. And so it comes from a place of acknowledging our full selves when we come to do this organizing work, but also understanding that without intersectionality and its analysis, we're not going to be able to win. So by that I mean, if we want to get to scale, and if we want to create change in policies that will have an impact on immigrants, we also understand that immigration and systematic discrimination affects other communities. So if we're able to connect with other communities that have shared experiences, we have more people, more power, and we will be able to create the change that we want to see in our communities. So for example, we are working very closely with many of the organizations led by young Black folks that are organizing around racial justice, part of the Black Lives Matter broader movement. And the reason why we're doing that intentionally in similar ways as we have done with the LGBTQ movement is because we understand that our experiences around discrimination are tied, and we're really trying to tackle systematic changes that are coming from the same source. So whether that is mass incarceration, right? Deportation centers are also part of that pipeline of private prisons where our families are being held. And that has been the analysis of our work. And what's been really wonderful to see is that our young people are already there. I mean, there's just something about our generation where they see themselves as more than just one experience or one identity, and that has really created this space for us to strategically build alliances and figure out ways for how we work together. And it's also created strategic opportunities to bring the rest of our community into this organizing approach. For example, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, United We Dream was one of the first organizations that came out in support of the work that Black youth were doing in the Capitol takeover, because we understood that the racial discrimination and targeting that Black communities experience is in many ways similar to the experiences of immigrants. So think about people driving who look undocumented, like SB 1070 in Arizona, right? If you look undocumented, you will be stopped. So we knew that there were many connections here, and therefore we took a stand. But many of the people that are engaging United We Dream, which is a network of 50 organizations in 25 states, ask, wait, why are we taking a stand on this issue? I thought that we just work for immigrants. And so it took work to get our people also to understand, and that has actually helped us build a lot of really strong and solid alliances at the local level between our communities, between Black Lives Matter, with LGBTQ communities as well. And we believe that's the only way that we're going to be able to win.
That's great. Matt, I'm going to ask you a question that'll kind of loop around with the same, different form. So you moved from like the nonprofit world into the nonprofit world, that is, onto the foundation side of things. So what is as a funder, the sort of, and in the social movement space, the sort of riskiest bet you ever took that you think, well, that really paid off? And then what's the like big mistake that you would warn people away from? So in order to not put you on the spot, I'll talk about a mistake I made, just so everybody is already exposed. We all came out about our mistakes. So I remember when I moved up to Santa Cruz, we were organizing organizing infrastructure for activists from Latin America and Latino communities in the United States. We were trying to get local Latino communities part of it. And I remember being in a conversation where I said, well, we're going to bring the intellectual resources of the university and the organizing resources of the community, which was like the stupidest fucking thing to say, because there's intellectual resources in the community, and it diminishes people's sense of their authority, and you're not really taking advantage of their intelligence. And it really first I had to do like about a year of relational work, penance basically, of one-on-ones and visiting people and building things back up. The big lesson I took away was to really respect the intelligence that's in the community. And so it really transformed me, I think made me a better intellectual, but came out of a mistake. So all of us make mistakes. What's the riskiest bet you ever took? And then the thing as a funder you would sort of warn other funders about?
Well, I've never made a mistake, so I'm really having a
Yeah.
hard time focusing here. I think that all foundations are very risk adverse, and I think that taking on marriage was a big bet, and it was risky, and but turned out not to be, right? Now, if this had been a complete flop, then I'd be able to say, boy, did we it was all Evan's fault. I think I don't think that I can think of a risky thing that we've done. I can think of a lot of several millions of dollars that have been wasted, or I have been responsible for essentially wasting. And that was, to your point, allowing my desire for groups to get resources, to have them chase the dollar instead of what was core to their mission. So a good example is trying to align maybe 30 grantees to support efforts in key states around either marriage or non-discrimination. And the theory was that they would work in Ohio or North Carolina or you name the state, and they would integrate their work into that of the statewide C3 public education campaign and be additive to it. When, I'll just take some faith grantees. Many of our faith grantees, they're much more interested in denominational change and increasing the number of welcoming and affirming congregations. And they kind of did the non-discrimination or marriage work in a very superficial way, and mainly were going around the state trying to get more welcoming and affirming congregations and more votes to change denominational policy at their next quadrennial or biennial convention. And not that that work isn't good, and not that that work isn't valuable, but that's not what we were to Evan's ladder. That's not what we. So I think that's where I made the biggest mistakes. Is and coming from the nonprofit world, you will go where the dollars are. And as much as you say you're not going to move outside your mission or your sweet spot, you do, or you pay lip service to whatever the grant is, and that's a really hard call. So
Good. So I know Evan has never made a mistake, so I'm going to change the question up a little bit here, because again, this is really for funders. What's the single most, when everybody says single, there's, I'm just exaggerating, of course, but what was the sort of most useful philanthropic help, and what was the, there they go again, right, that you'd like people to know about?
Before he answers that, and I think this might be related to what Evan might say, is that
As you're the one who told him something? That's right.
No, but there is this tension, which I still don't understand, about giving too much money, right? To me, it's like in the real world, many foundations are still working in the 1980s when $50,000 probably meant something. I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but it doesn't mean much in 2016. And so, on the other hand, I never thought it was possible to give a group too much money. But we have seen recently in trying to pool money together with some foundations and just giving $500,000 to a state campaign, which, if you look at what's going on in the presidential election, $500,000 is like, they burned through that in a day. It swamped organizations. So that is another mistake that I think, on the one hand, we are so reluctant to put real money on the table. And on the other hand, many of us haven't figured out the way to put real money on the table and not swamp an organization. So I'd say that's a mistake.
That's great. So what we're trying to do is to provide, and thank you so much, these kind of key things for this audience of funders. So from that perspective, what was the sort of single most useful thing, Evan, and the thing where you're, God, I wish they didn't stay on that kind of thing?
Well, I think the single most, or certainly one of the most useful things in my experience working with philanthropy and benefiting from philanthropy, was the early commitment of a small handful of funders to the goal and strategy, something they had not previously been committed to, but they were sold on it and they decided to jump into it. And some of them stepped up with what at that point was a decent amount of money, although not the full amount that they, as well as I, knew was going to be needed. But they stayed with it. And so I think probably the happiest part of a good story was the vision that some funders brought to our goal and campaign and strategy, and their willingness to invest, even if not fully to scale, with enough to allow us to get the thing going and show that it could keep going. And then they stayed with it. And I really was very lucky to have a handful of funders who stayed with me on this journey through many disappointments and defeats, and a lot of questioning of the strategy again that then resulted in an affirmation of the strategy, and to fund at what for them were decent levels with regard to their LGBT philanthropy. Although if you matched that against the philanthropy they would invest in other sectors, it wasn't a lot of money, to Matt's point. But from our point of view, it was a decent amount of money, and it paid off, and I think they all now feel like it was a good investment. So that's the willingness to come in with decent money and to stick with it was the best part. The critique of it was never as much as it should have been. We could have gone much further, much faster with a lot more money. It didn't really measure up significantly to their other philanthropy, though by our sector's philanthropy it was generous and good. But I do think, in a much less complicated way, that the tenacity, the perseverance, the courage they showed in staying with it made a big difference, and was not always the case, even in their own philanthropy in other areas. And could I,
yes, please,
just before I forget, I want to build on what Cristina was talking about earlier. Cristina was talking about from the side of empowerment and community building and campaign building and movement building, and understanding from sort of the side of us, the advocates. Without taking away from any of that, I want to say that one of the things we put a lot of energy into, and that I think is very important for philanthropy to support, is about also, again, related to goal and strategy, not just thinking about who are we in our intersectional identities and so on, but who are we trying to persuade? What do they need to hear? whether we like them or not in terms of the way they think of the world, whether they think of the world in intersectional terms or in the kinds of identities we would like to underscore and strengthen, our goal is to persuade them to come to a different place. And so I would say it's very, very important, in addition to this side of empowerment, to actually put money and activism and energy and respect into understanding the reachable but not yet reached middle, not the true hard, awful opposition, but the reachable and not yet reached. And what is it they need to hear? What is it they need to see in order to come to the outcome that we want? And many of them will make that journey without fully according with our way of seeing the world in every respect. They may not be as politically correct or as respectful or as sensitive to diversity or all the things that we value, but we want to move them.
Yeah.
And so it's just very important to not get so caught up in what feels good for us or what is necessary for us to do this piece. And I don't want to take anything away from that. But we can't do that at the expense of neglecting how do you move the middle? How do you get the people who may not be 100% with you, but you can get them where you need them to be on the thing you need them to be? And that's from my point of view, a crucial goal.
Cristina, let me ask you that question too. From your perspective, what's been the single, or again exaggerating, but what's the most important kind of philanthropic support that's been crucial to you, and where do you think there's been sort of a mistake on the part of philanthropy?
I think from our experience, it's been being able to work with a small core of committed foundations in a way that it's more like a partnership as opposed to sort of like power over relationship. And most of the grants that United We Dream has received have been general support and continue to be, and that it's huge for us to be able to do what we need to move the work forward. And so I have not felt, and the organization hasn't experienced, feeling like we have to do things differently to get X, Y, and Z grant. And so being able to work with a small core of funders who understand that, story development, story sharing, relationship building is important, that sometimes we develop a strategy, but then it's going to change that a little bit because movement building is vibrant. And an organization like United We Dream, who's full of young people with energy and ideas, it's also very vibrant, and it's membership-led, right, too. So being able to have a very strong relationship grounded on trust to be able to say, we developed this plan, but now we're tweaking things, and this is why. And being able to have that back and forth has been huge. I mean, one of the best examples that I talk about a lot, not only because Taryn is here, but that has been the relationship with Unbound Philanthropy as being one of the first funders, and similarly with the Haas Junior Fund, where I feel that our relationships have allowed for us to have flexibility to be able to use resources where we need to, and to allow us to be creative, to innovate, but to also challenge the status quo that perhaps more established or older organizations within the immigrant rights movement haven't been able to do. And that has been, for me, very, very helpful in advancing our work.
The thing I would say that actually has been the most helpful, and it speaks to kind of a potential, so we're a research shop that works with social movement organizations, and we have in the last couple of years been able to convince foundations to give us essentially operational funds. We call them ready response funds, because what happens is that folks in the movement come up with a thing they need an answer to. We say, great, let's go write a grant to a foundation. We'll go through the laborious 6-month process of negotiating with them. Then we'll figure out the contracts, and by the time we get you the research, it'll be irrelevant to the struggle. So instead, we've been able to argue for and receive ready response money. So when requests come in, we can decide through a filter whether it's a question we can answer, what aligns with our skills, and with our alliances and stuff. So one quick example, we were asked by the National Partnership for New Americans whether or not the naturalization fee actually was impeding naturalizations. Congressional Research Service had done a set of studies saying no, really wasn't an impediment. We showed why those studies were wrong, redid it. In about 2.5 months, we just went right from the request, went to Citizenship and Immigration Services. CIS decided now it has an automatic waiver for anybody making less than 150% of the poverty level. 80 to 90,000 new people got naturalized over the last 1.5 years as a result of that fee waiver, to which really organizations made the move, but the research contributed because there was flexibility to be able to respond. And I think from our perspective, research often gets thought of as this sort of discrete, like we'll fund a project instead of funding a capacity to respond and sort of trusting that we're going to answer good questions for good people.
To help us understand the mechanics of the dialogue along a long pathway in which there were defeats and setbacks, that you managed to keep the funders on track, because you talk about the importance of staying the course, and I think it sounds like you found a like-minded person, but I know it's more complicated than that. So tell us about how you get people over those hurdles when, especially since we're so data-driven now, when the data starts to look like it's going south, how do you get people to say, no, wait, we're going to stay on this?
Yeah, so I think it was a combination of things, and of course it wasn't all just me or any one thing. But one is that I was able to find a handful of funders who came to believe in the goal and came to believe in the strategy and became, as Cristina talked about, partners in that work. And they for the most part, were good at being engaged enough to be true partners and thought contributors and helpers, and they did the work Matt described of working to align a field to some extent by strategically granting to others in a way that would help reinforce relationships toward the strategy without, for the most part, crossing the line into being too demanding at the wrong time or too meddling or creating their own power centers and da-da-da-da. So that was one element. Secondly, they stayed with it. They stayed with it through the ups and downs. One of the mechanisms that was very helpful was some of those same handful of funders who came in early to the Freedom to Marry campaign and who were also funding other necessary partners whom we were working with so that there was a field that got supported. The funders themselves created a funding collaborative called the Civil Marriage Collaborative, or CMC, that proved to be a mechanism for these funders to reinforce their own understanding and their own engagement, but to do so in fulfillment of the Freedom to Marry strategy. So it was created specifically to allow them to fund the state-based work that was a necessary element of our strategy, which otherwise individually they might not have been able to or wanted to do, and thereby get invested in that while giving, of course, real resources to this field. And even though that water did not go through my watering can, it went into, quote, my field, and that was very helpful. And I was the principal advisor to this funder collaborative, but not the decider. And they, as they deepened their own involvement, they had their relationships and they had their own knowledge. They also had their own ideas. And where there was a little bit of friction was when that mechanism, from my point of view, somewhat outlasted its usefulness because of the way in which the whole work changed, and Freedom to Marry became more capable of actually doing all that work itself, and the funders could have more easily moved some of that stuff to Freedom to Marry at some point, but they were very attached to their own involvement and engagement, which was of real value, and so there was a little bit of friction on that part, but far outweighed by the benefits of strengthening their own engagement, their own knowledge, their own sustained investment in a crucial part of the strategy.
As Evan said, there was a plan, and we invested in the plan, and it was a plan that we all bought off on, both key movement organizations led by Evan and the funders. So it went quicker than we thought. The goal was 20 years, and it went quicker than that. So, yeah, there were lots of ups and downs, but pretty miraculous all in all.
I'll give one other example of a mechanism that the funders came up with that proved of value, one of the things we identified was the need to crack the code on certain forms of messaging and message research and how to reach that reachable but not yet reached middle that I talked about. And the funders were very, very engaged in that problem. And one of the things they identified was that the movement organizations, many of which they were supporting, were doing a lot of research, but everybody was sort of doing their own thing and getting their own grant to do this. And sometimes the funders themselves would do a dive into something, and they would just commission a poll and do this. And there was no real bringing it all together and cracking it and synthesizing it and avoiding duplication. And so the funders came to an agreement with us and then our team of colleagues that everybody was going to have to pool that in a much more effective way. Pool the decision on how to use what they came up with, but also what to fund in the first place. And funders became much more willing to actually say to the other grantees, if we give you a grant to do this, you're going to have to share it. You're going to have to be engaged. So it was another way in which funders could play a leveraging role and get engaged in the broader question, not just the impulse or the problem solving of the moment.
The question that I'll ask is, it's about the kind of the challenges and tensions that arise when funders decide to invest a lot of money over a long period of time in one campaign. When, I guess, how do you negotiate the kind of other campaigns arising? And I'm thinking in particular about the DREAM Act versus comprehensive immigration reform. When, and I'm thinking, what were the parallels or analogies in, the freedom to marry movement? What other things kind of came up that weren't supported, or how did you negotiate, I guess, the need to have a field that's responsive to multiple issues while really resourcing this one campaign in a way and at a level that would enable it to succeed?
I think in terms of how we experienced it, United We Dream was just emerging in the time where you had the campaign for immigration reform, RIFA, the RIFA campaign, that was a national campaign that had a lot of resources, both C3, C4, and brought many or almost all of the key players of the immigrant rights movement, versus you have this group of young people who were trying to push for the DREAM Act. And it did, and particularly in 2010 is where the tension both around who was getting resourced and who was not getting resourced, and who had a winning strategy. Or what is the winning strategy, right? And so from our part, we got to a point where the strategies were not in alignment anymore. And that obviously created friction within the movement players. And I think it also, elevated to the funder tension as well. And we didn't have as much resources as the RIFA campaign did. We, had like one or two grants maybe at the time. Totally, we were like sleeping on, churches of like the floor churches and things like that. I mean, we were using the resources of the community to push this campaign forward. And, who knows? I mean, I always feel like I have the question, if the campaign for the DREAM Act would have been much more resourced, would we be at a different place? I don't know. But the reality is that, at least from our experience and how we, felt this situation, is the tension on strategy, and knowing that there was this larger national campaign that was much more resourced than the work that we were doing. And that ultimately, and I was just talking to Evan about this, losing the DREAM Act was like losing forward in many ways, because without that, we couldn't have gotten to the victory of DACA in 2012, which was, the most significant victory that we have seen in the immigrant rights movement.
The losing forward phrase that Cristina and I were just talking about is from a speech I gave at a moment when I was trying to get people to recommit to the winning strategy at a time when people were afraid. It was when we were losing in 2004. We'd lost 13 ballot measures. Bush had just gotten reinstalled, and people were blaming us for that on top of that, all falsely, but there it was. And there was a lot
By
of
the way, I love that
consternation.
expression, reinstalled. That was
There was a lot of I can say whatever I want now. There was a lot of consternation even within the movement, and some people were calling for regressing. And I gave a talk that I then published and so on that talked about lessons from the scary work of winning. And it's out there on Google and on our website and so on. And if lesson one is wins trump losses. You're not going to win every battle, but wins, strategic wins, are the engine by which you can keep going and circle back and overcome losses and gain more ground. So, in partial answer to your question, I always believed that fighting for the freedom to marry was not going to be everything. I know that there are many other people who have other things they care about. We as gay people, we as LGBT community members have many things we care about. Marriage is not everything. But I believe that marriage would be the thing that would advance us the furthest, A, not only to winning marriage, which was important, but B, in detoxifying and changing people's understanding in a way that would enable us to continue and build and go on. Not everybody agreed with that, but that was my vision, my view. That's what the funders were backing. Nobody thought winning marriage was the only thing that mattered, but it was the thing of all the things that would be the most effective in gaining the most ground for the most people and setting us in place for the next. Wins trump losses. The second lesson from this in this speech is that you can't win every battle, but you can at least make sure that you're fighting so as to where you don't win, lose forward. And so, for example, the successes that Cristina talked about in the DREAM Act, they actually didn't achieve their goal. They're not done. They haven't won yet. We don't have a DREAM Act. But they were a singular example of focused and effective transforming the narrative and empowering a whole base of activism, giving people more ways to come into the immigration discussion and providing a pathway and a template for moving forward, including legal and political improvisations like the one that's in front of the Supreme Court. A very good set of deliverables, losing forward, albeit not yet the success of the goal. So if you're going to measure campaigns as a funder, you need to think about where's the win and how are we going to do something, and ideally it's going to be a win that's going to be a gift that keeps on giving beyond the narrow contours of the win. And if you think that through and then commit to that and have the right leadership and give them the right resources, then I believe, lesson to funders, you need to be able to weather the fact that not everybody's going to like your choice. If you wait for everybody to like every aspect of everything, you're not going to fund the DREAM Act, and you're not going to fund the freedom to marry, and you're always going to be funding the harmonic convergence of everything in the name of everything, and it's going to not get you anything. So that's just the way it is. You have to be willing to make a choice and to invest in good leadership and give it the resources and stick with it and help it align a field to get to a goal, and hopefully you've chosen a goal that will be a goal that's even bigger than the goal, as marriage has been.
great. So we wanted to make sure you got a few things from this discussion. I want to say what they were and see whether or not you actually got them. And I think one way I put it is that first, to understand there's no silver bullet, that building movements requires many different elements, but there's often a pretty strategic target that is a goal or an outcome that can actually organize things. I really got something from that ladder of clarity. To understand that movement building is intersectional, particularly now, that we need to not just think about the particular issues we're working on, but how they might stream into broader movements for transformations. To understand that it takes time. Sometimes it's shorter than you might have thought, but that's a pretty long battle that you've been involved in, the immigration reform. It takes time. And then the final thought that I think we all wanted to make sure that you take away is that progress can be measured. It can be measured in actual policy wins. It can be measured in the number of people mobilized, but it can also be measured by the transformations that occur in people's consciousness around things like marriage equality, in people's consciousness about the dreamers. It can be measured in the transformations of young, undocumented upstarts challenging an entire traditional immigrant rights movement to move in a very different direction, those who stuck it out for marriage equality, et cetera. That transformations count as much as transactions, that they can also be measured and held. And then finally, our biggest lesson for all of you, particularly those of you who are funders, you should fund more of this. So let's give our panel a big round of applause.